Hello everyone, my name is Toby Horrorboy. Let's make a Huggy Wuggy Animatronic. As you can see, the base animatronic that we're going to be using is a For Real Friends Moodwings baby dragon. There are a lot of animatronics that would have been a great pick to turn into Huggy Wuggy, but I picked this little guy because of the eye movement and the wing movement. And I know that Huggy Wuggy does not have wings, we will get to that later, you will see. The first step in customizing an animatronic is usually just taking off everything that we don't need. I did this in a previous video and I'd really recommend watching it, especially if you want to see what the inside of one of these toys looks like. So in that previous video, I removed most of what we need to get rid of, and now I can focus on the eyes. It's really important to do this early on because as soon as I start working on the body, it's going to be really difficult to get to his eyes. What I'm doing here is just scuffing them up a little bit with some sandpaper to get them ready for painting. This Moodwings baby dragon has like molded in eyelashes. I used a knife, I used the cutting head of the Dremel, but what worked best by far was just sanding them off with the Dremel. And then I did the same to her other outer eyelashes. I swapped back to the cutting head and removed his ears, and then I got rid of as much of his legs as possible. The only parts of this animatronic that actually matter in this project are the eyes, the wings, and like everything inside that makes it move. This baby dragon and Huggy Wuggy have very different shapes, so I'm trying to get rid of as much as possible that we don't need, so that nothing messes with the silhouette later on. Like for example, that his legs don't stick out too much and create a weird bulge in his chest that shouldn't be there. Okay, now that we're done with that, we can go back to the eyes. I put on about 3 coats of Mod Podge mixed with a little bit of water, and that's as a primer so that the paint sticks better. And then I just painted on the whites and the black part of the eyes. Looking back at this, I wish that I made the black part a little bit smaller, but there's not a lot that I can do about that now. I'm really not very good at painting things smoothly, but that is okay. There is absolutely no morality in not being very good at crafts. It really doesn't matter. What matters is that we did it. Anyway, once that's painted, I put on another 2 coats of Mod Podge to seal it in. And just for the sake of knowing that no stuffing or loose fur or anything is going to get on the inside of this animatronic later on, I'm just going to cut these circles out of craft foam and glue them into everywhere that we removed something from. It's probably not super necessary, but it also doesn't hurt. And in a final attempt to shave down as much as possible, I'm just dremeling the sides of his legs a little bit. We are now done with our prep work, and we can move on to more interesting stuff. So next up, we're going to make the base of the body. So these are EVA foam floor mats, or at least pieces of them. I mentioned earlier that Huggy Wuggy and this dragon are very different shapes. The eyes are going to be our base point for where everything else goes. Everything else is going to move around or be disguised as something else, but the eyes are the only things that are going to be visible on the outside of the animatronic. Everything else on the outside is just blue fur. I did some maths to figure out how tall the head, body, and legs all had to be, but in between finishing Huggy Wuggy and recording this video, I made a whole Venom nightlight for my friend, so I have completely forgotten what maths I did to get those numbers. Anyway, so we glued together EVA foam to elongate his torso, used the Dremel to scuff up the underside of the animatronic, and then glue them together. Also, I messed up the maths somehow and had to go back in and add some more. But now that that's done, we can go in and fix up his head shape. Huggy Wuggy's head is very triangular. So much like with the torso, I'm just going to be using some EVA foam pieces and gluing them in to sort of bulk out the area and make his head the right shape. I know it looks weird, but just bear with me. And to protect his eye paint, our little guy gets to be covered in cling film. And then we're just gonna Dremel that down until it's smooth and in line with the rest of his head. When I mentioned everything shifting around a little bit, this is kind of what I was referring to. Like using the eyes as a reference point, for the head to be the right size and shape, the bottom of his head has to come all of the way down to the dragon's legs. And Huggy Wuggy has such a long torso that we had to add a lot of foam to the bottom of the toy. Also, I had to add more foam to the bottom of the toy. Again, he's getting so tall. And then I smooth out the foam parts of his body with the Dremel. And now it's time to make his legs. I really wanted to use wire for this so that I could sort of pose the legs, but I really don't think that it would be strong enough. This animatronic is really top heavy because the baby dragon is quite heavy and because the legs are so long. And I think that if I made his legs out of anything that wasn't very sturdy, that he would just topple over. So I made them out of wooden dowel and cut them to size with the Dremel. To attach the legs, I first drew out where I wanted them to go and then used a drill to get rid of most of the foam. In hindsight, I wish I made the legs a little bit further apart, but as you can see, they're already pretty close to the edge. And then I extracted any tiny little pieces still left in there with a pair of jewelry pliers. I made sure that the leg holes were really deep so that the legs had no chance of coming out. And now we can glue the wooden dowel into our body. I'm using contact cement here. It is my favorite adhesive and I use it for almost everything. It is very strong and it is extremely difficult to get off once it's cured. This was a little bit tricky because you have to put it on the two pieces that you want to stick together. And then when it's like tacky or almost dry, you put the pieces together and they will never come apart. You can see how hard I have to push the leg in to get it to go all the way to the end of the hole, because the two pieces tried to attach as soon as they came into contact. Once his legs are on, I cut them down to a more accurate length. Here's how he looks so far. He is very tall. Taller than I anticipated, but that's okay. And now we can move on and make his weird little gloved feet. I made this little pattern and then traced out 6 of them onto our EVA foam. Because Huggy Wuggy has a left and a right foot, I flipped the pattern for 3 of them. And that's so that they're both being cut out of the good side of the foam. I cut out all 6 pieces and then used the contact cement to glue them together. Each foot is 3 pieces of EVA foam high, with the bad side of the foam facing down. And then I used the Dremel to shape them properly because they're meant to be quite curved at the top. The next thing I did was glue the feet on. This wasn't a good idea and I shouldn't have done this. I don't know how I thought I was gonna get the fur onto the legs, but this was not it. But I don't realize that yet, so let's look at the arms first. We're going to be attaching the arms to the wing stubs so that they move. As you can see, there's not a lot of movement there, but something's better than nothing. I'm going to be making the base of the arms out of aluminium wire so that they're posable. This wire is really easy to bend and it'll hold whatever pose you put it into. Each arm is going to be a really long piece of wire folded in half. So it'll be like having 2 strands of wire on each arm. I'm securing it by threading it through the screw hole and just looping it around itself. And then bringing up the other end and looping that through there as well. And then I just drown the whole thing in hot glue because it won't hurt. And at this point you might be thinking, Tobias, we are nearly 7 minutes in and I have seen no blue fur. Don't worry, I promise that we're nearly there. But fur is expensive and I will not be wasting any. So we're going to make a pattern out of some scrap fabric, starting with the body. This is very easy to do. I just sandwiched him between 2 pieces of fabric. I pinned and then drew along where the 2 pieces met, and that's going to be our pattern. Once that's cut out, we can trace it straight onto the bad side of the fur. You need to be really careful when cutting fur with scissors, because if you cut it wrong, you can just cut all of the length of the fur off. And that will not look very good. We don't want any weird short little blunt bits. You can either use scissors very, very carefully, or just use a knife. I'm cutting the pieces out a little bit bigger than what we've drawn. This is called a seam allowance, and if I didn't add this, it wouldn't fit onto his body. Next up, I'm going to pin together our front and back pieces and then sew up the side seams using my sewing machine. Then we can slide the body fur onto the animatronic and sew up our other little seams. This bit has to be done by hand, and fur is so hard to hand sew. The fur always tries to follow where the needle is going, and it's the worst. The worst part of working with fur by far. So we have to do the 2 shoulder seams and the crotch seam. And at this point it's time to do the leg fur, and I finally realized that I shouldn't have glued the feet on. A little bit earlier I was talking about how strong contact cement is. As a point of reference, notice how the foam is tearing before the actual glue separates? This isn't a problem because it's all gonna get covered with fabric, but look at that. With that out of the way, I cut out 2 long rectangles to be the legs and machine sew them into tubes. If I'd left the feet on there, I would have had to hand sew these onto the animatronic, and that would have been awful. I don't want to do that. Then we can turn our legs right way out and put them on, and then just hand sew them straight onto the body. Actually, another thing about working with fur, I'm gonna do this on every single seam for this animatronic, but I'll explain it here. Once you sew fur, whether it's with a machine or by hand, it's a really good idea to run a pin or a needle along the seam and just pick out any of the hairs, because quite a few hairs will end up caught inside the stitches, and that doesn't look very good. By picking the hair out and combing it down, you can make the seams basically invisible. Now we can move back to the feet. These are going to be covered with yellow fleece, and I really think that the black is going to show through. So we're going to do a few coats of Mod Podge and paint them yellow so that they match. So each piece is going to be covered with 2 pieces of fleece, the bottom bit and the top bit. The bottom is the same as the pattern for the foot, but with a little bit of seam allowance. And the top is that same basic shape, but much bigger because it has to go over that whole curved area. The foam we're using is really sturdy, so I can just pin the top piece and the bottom piece directly into it. When I was first learning how to sew, like over a decade ago, I made this really terrible little Sonic the Hedgehog pincushion, and this always makes me think of that for some reason. This step always looks kind of horrifying, but we can just do a ladder stitch between our top and bottom pieces to sew them together. Even though it's really finicky to pin and sew, I still really like covering things this way. Once they're fully sewn up, we can cut out the hole where the leg pole is going to go, and then just glue them on with contact cement. Also, I should have realized this way earlier, but Huggy Wuggy has like finger lines on his hands and feet, and I just totally forgot I was not thinking about them, so I'm just embroidering them on now. It's definitely not ideal, but I'm hiding the knot up underneath the fur, so it'll be okay. Moving along, the arms are basically the same as the legs. So we cut out 2 tubes and then sew up the side seams and then turn them inside out. Now we can slide them on over the metal arm frame and hand sew them onto the body. Huggy Wuggy's hands are the same size and shape as his feet, so we're going to use the same pattern piece, but this time we can machine sew it, because instead of a foam center, we're going to use regular stuffing. And I actually remembered to do the finger line embroidery this time. We're going to stuff both of his hands and make sure it goes all the way to the tips of his fingers, and then use the same stuffing to pad out the arms. Visually, I don't think that the arms need to be stuffed. But because the wire is the bit that actually moves, I didn't want it just moving around inside of a fur tube, but I thought that if we stuffed the arms, then the wire would have to move the whole arm with it. To finish up this section, I'm going to hand sew up the ends of the hands and hand sew them on. And this next bit is the worst thing I've seen on any of my animatronics so far. It's head patterning time. Much like with the body, I've done a mock-up out of test fabric, and he kind of looks like he's going to rob a bank. But we can take off his disguise and cut those pieces out of fur. I sew up the 2 sides and the top seam, and then Malkav came over to say hi, so here's a little Malkav break. She investigates every animatronic I work on, and she thinks that sewing machines are a playground for her. But then I had to kick her out of the room because I had to sand some more plastic. I'm going to be gluing the fur down around the eye, so I need that area to be sanded so that the glue sticks. This is the final time that we'll be seeing his original face, which means that it's the perfect time to take these 2 magnets and glue them on. Some of you have probably figured out why we need these, but we'll get to that later, because right now we have to cut out his eye holes. I could have cut his eye holes out when I first cut out the head, but they have to be in exactly the right spot. If either eye hole is even a few millimeters off, it will be very obvious. So instead, I'm doing the very normal activity of feeling around for his eyeballs, and then slowly cutting the fur away and hoping that I don't make a mistake. Once both of his eyes are free, I really carefully glue down the edges with contact cement. Now, some of the fur around his eyes is just way too long, so I go in with the thread clippers and just try and trim it back as best as I can. I'd never really had to trim fur like this before, and it was really stressful. If I messed it up, I was gonna have to do the whole head again. Honestly, I probably left it a little bit too long anyway, but it does look much better. And you can still see the original purple of the face. You were always going to be able to. I knew right from the start that I was going to have to paint a dark blue around his eyes. And I'm just making sure that all of the purple is covered and then blending it out. This also helps hide the edge of the fur and gives his eyes some more definition. It's basically eyeliner. Now, the Moodwings baby dragon has its battery pack on the back of its head, and I need to be able to access that for if and when I need to change the batteries. This is kind of a horrible way to do it, but I'm just cutting a slit in the fur on the back of his head off to one side so that I can pull that back and access the battery pack. This is not a very professional execution of this, but this little guy is just for me and the fur will cover it up anyway. But if he was made out of any other material, I would not be doing it like this. Now I sew the head onto the body, not including the bit at the back of the neck that's going to flip open for the battery pack. I can't sew that bit down because I need to be able to open it, so I'm going to be using press studs. I cut out a tiny circle of fur where the press stud is going to go and then just sew it in. And this is just at the bottom of the slit that I cut. To finish closing up the back of his head, I'm also going to put in a hook and eye. I'm sewing this most of the way up the slit near the power button, just so that it doesn't open accidentally and you can't open it without unhooking it. I was live streaming parts of this and I had 2 people point out that I'd forgotten something very important. I had completely forgotten to do the Velcro on Huggy Wuggy's hands. There is a single strip of black Velcro on each of his palms. I'm so sorry, I lost the usernames, but you 2 know who you are. Thank you so much. I would cry if I had forgotten to put those on. And thankfully I had just enough black Velcro, and I just hand sewed it onto his hands and feet. I don't think he has it on the underside of his feet, but ours does, I guess. I think his feet are just more of his hands anyway, so... And now we're up to the final part. He doesn't have a mouth at the moment, but don't worry, because we're gonna give him two. Now, Huggy Wuggy has two different mouths. He's got like a happy smiling one, and then like a scary one, I guess. And of course, I was always gonna make the scary one with all the teeth, but it is not significantly more effort to just make the other one as well, so he can have both. And they're going to be attached with magnets so that they can swap out easily. We're going to make his smiling mouth first. I'm gonna cut the pattern I made out of a high density foam. We're not using the EVA foam floor mats here, we're using the nicer stuff because you're gonna be able to see it. To start giving them the right shape, I'm gonna curve out the edges with the Dremel, and then I'm gonna use the hot knife to carve out the indent in the middle. As you can see, that wasn't very neat. I try and tidy it up a little bit, and even though it's not perfect, it is much better. The next step is to heat seal it using the heat gun, and that'll help get it ready for painting. I did a couple of coats of Mod Podge, but it just wasn't smooth enough, so I ended up doing a few coats of Plastidip as well. Plastidip is an aerosol, so I had to spray it outside, and I just haven't figured out a good setup to film the spraying things outside segments of these videos. I paint it red and then do a gloss clear coat. Now, our animatronic's face is slightly curved, so I'm going to heat form the mouth using the heat gun, and that means it'll sit flush with his face, and it won't just be like weird and flat. As the final step for this mouth, I attach the magnets with super glue. And before we make the other mouth, there's just one last thing to do. This caused so much controversy over on TikTok. I want to see what you guys think. Huggy Wuggy's bow is either yellow or blue. A lot of people remembered it being red, but I can't find a single example where his ribbon is red. Our animatronic is gonna have both yellow and blue. It's just a ribbon that can be tied on, so I can really do any color. He might have the blue most of the time, but I honestly just think that the yellow looks so much better. The blue really blends into his fur. I think it's a really odd design choice. Anyway, this is just ribbon from Spotlight. I tied it into a bow around his neck and then cut it to the right length. And then I burned the edges with a lighter so that they won't fray. Okay, now that that's out of the way, we can make his other mouth. We're going to start off by making a paper pattern, and then cut out our backing piece. Now this is just 1mm thick craft foam, and it's going to be the inside of the mouth. We're going to cut out the same shape from our high density foam, and then cut out the inner bit. This is what the two pieces look like together. And now we can start shaping the lips with the Dremel. This was much easier than last time because I didn't mess anything up with the hot knife. Once we're happy with how that looks, we can heat seal and heat form it. I did a few coats of Plastidip and then painted the lips red. I sealed the inner mouth with a few coats of Mod Podge and then painted it black. I used contact cement to glue the two pieces together. We really don't want any of the back piece to be visible, so I'm just going around the edges very carefully to remove some of the excess. I also sanded the back piece with the Dremel to help with this. Now we can do a few coats of Mod Podge on the outer back area, and then paint it red to match the front. And now we can finally make the teeth. And as it does every time, making the teeth took ages. So Huggy Wuggy has several rows of teeth in his mouth. But for our animatronic, we just don't have that much space to work with, so I ended up only making 2 rows, to a total of 33 individual teeth. I started off by just making the inner teeth so I could see how everything fit. Each tooth was cut out of high density foam, and then carved into a point. Then each tooth was sanded to clean them up a bit, Mod Podged, and painted white. Once the teeth were finished, I used super glue to glue on the inner set. This was really nerve-wracking because I really only had one shot to place each tooth. If I had to rip one up and move it, it would completely ruin the paint below. We got the inner teeth on, and I think they look okay. There were a few spots where the glue seeped out from under the teeth, but I just went in with a paintbrush and some black paint, and it actually came up surprisingly well. You can barely see that there's glue there. And now for our outer teeth, we're gonna do all of that again, but more. And I'm not gonna make you watch me make teeth this time. So they've been made, and let's just glue them on. If you've watched my videos before, you'll probably know that I never make enough teeth on the first try. It happens every single time without fail. And this time I was short exactly 1 tooth. And sometimes I end up with weird little gaps and I have to go back in and fill them with more teeth later. But Huggy Wuggy actually does have gaps between his teeth. So that isn't just me not wanting to make more teeth, that's just what he looks like. Once everything's dry, I paint over any visible glue with the black paint, and then we can just apply a gloss coat to this whole piece. I super glue the magnets on and we would be finished here, except for one thing. I never gave him any eyelids, and that was kind of a stylistic choice. But I got a lot of comments on TikTok of people saying that he probably would look better with eyelids. And I thought about it for a bit and I decided that yeah, that probably would look better. Thanks to everyone who weighed in on that discussion. We're gonna paint those on. Okay, we are finally done. He is finished. And just before I show you the final result, I wanted to thank my dear friend Spencer for funding all of this. Spencer's TikTok is chaosduck.cos. All of his cosplays are incredible and I would highly recommend checking out their account, especially if you like the Magnus archives and Our Flag Means Death. Everyone please say thank you, Spencer. Thank you so much for watching. Here's the finished animatronic.